much. The chair is now pleased to recognize the Honorable Hakeem Jeffries from New York for 5 minutes.
Good morning. It's an honor and a privilege to be before the Federal Lands Subcommittee and the Natural Resources Committee. And let me also just thank Chairman McClintock and Ranking Member Hanabusa for your continuing leadership on a range of issues of importance to the nation, and for giving me the opportunity to present here today. I'm grateful for this chance to talk about H.R. 3979, the Keep America's Refuges Operational Act. This common sense bipartisan legislation will support conservation efforts at our nation's refuges in a way that saves taxpayer dollars and stimulates jobs and economic opportunity. I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record this letter of support from over 50 volunteer groups from throughout the nation who are independent, nonprofit organizations run by citizens who support the purposes and objectives of our nation's National Wildlife Refuges.
Without objection.
Our National Wildlife Refuge System is comprised of 566 refuges located in every U.S. state and territory. They make up over 800 million acres of habitat dedicated to the conservation of fish and wildlife. Each year, 47 million Americans visit our refuges, and these visits help support the local economy by generating over $2 billion in revenue and supporting approximately 35,000 local jobs. People visit refuges from all over to explore, hunt, fish, and experience America's natural beauty. Refuges also help to mold the next generation of conservationists and outdoor enthusiasts by providing learning experiences and cherished memories for America's families. But this wouldn't be possible without help from dedicated volunteers who donate 20% of the total service work at our refuges. They support full-time staff by helping to operate visitor centers, conduct fish and wildlife population surveys, maintain visitor structures, roads, and paths, fight invasive species, protect native plants and animals. Volunteers are of all ages, come from diverse walks of life, work in many different capacities, and truly represent the gorgeous mosaic that is the American people. One thing they have in common, they are all dedicated to preserving our country's natural beauty so that we can all enjoy it for years to come. That is why Representatives Graves, Whitman, Grijalva, and Sablan and I have proudly introduced the Keep America's Refuges Operational Act, otherwise named as CARA. This bill reauthorizes the National Wildlife Refuge System Volunteer Community Partnership and Education Program, a program that ensures public access to refuges can continue. Refuges have had a tremendous impact for communities all over America, even in my hometown of Brooklyn, New York. Staff and volunteers from the Wertheimer Refuge Complex have traveled to the Canarsie portion of my district to help middle school students build a pollinator and butterfly garden. That garden was constructed 2 years ago and is still going strong. They have also hosted elementary school students visiting the refuge on field trips to study local ecosystems. Because of their dedication, the children of Brooklyn, in the district I proudly represent, will grow up with an appreciation for America's nature and wildlife and its beauty. In today's world, the importance of preserving these beautiful places cannot be understated or overstated. As Carmen Wheeler, a second grade student in Brooklyn, wrote me, "I think we should keep the wildlife refuges safe, even if they are far away, because they will always keep our world healthier." Advancing CARO has been a collaborative process, and I greatly appreciate the hard work on both sides of the aisle from representatives including Grijalva, Sablan, Whitman, and Graves. Through CARO, we will demonstrate the economic benefits to be gained from protecting America's natural beauty and being good stewards of our environment that God has given to us. Again, thank you for your time and for inviting me here to testify on behalf of H.R. 3979. I look forward to a continued partnership with this committee to ensure the legislation moves forward through the House and becomes law. Thank you.
Now pleased to recognize Ms. Caroline Brower, Director of Government Affairs for the National Wildlife Refuge Association in Washington. Welcome.
Good morning, Chairman McClintock, Ranking Member Hanabusa, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Caroline Brower, and I'm the Director of Government Affairs for the National Wildlife Refuge Association. We are thrilled to support the Keep America's Refuges Operational Act, and we appreciate the hard work of Mr. Jeffries and Mr. Whitman in getting this bill drafted and introduced. Volunteers and friends groups are the backbone of our local refuges, and we always appreciate the opportunity to brag about them. This legislation reauthorizes the Volunteer and Community Partnership Act. It enables the refuge system to expand its volunteer programs and partner with community groups such as friends organizations. These outreach programs increase public awareness of the natural, historical, and cultural resources of each refuge. In short, this bill allows volunteers and friends groups to more fully participate in their local refuge. Refuges belong to each American, and community involvement and support is critical to their success. Volunteering on National Wildlife Refuges spans all age groups, professions, geography, and time commitments to provide the system with a wealth of knowledge and abilities. Annually, friends and volunteers provide an additional 20% of work on refuges throughout the nation. They do everything from banding birds, to raising fish at fish hatcheries, to conducting archery training and elementary school programs, to trash cleanups and maintenance work. Close to 42,000 volunteers contribute in excess of 1.5 million hours of work each year. We do note, however, that volunteers cannot replace the work of refuge staff. There are certain things that volunteers simply cannot do, including managing refuges, law enforcement, or running the maintenance or biology programs. The partnership of staff and volunteers works well, and we must encourage volunteerism while maintaining a healthy level of staffing. The Refuge Association has a long history of working with volunteer and friends groups. We provide technical assistance to folks looking for help with starting a visitor center gift shop, a new friends organization, or even a new refuge. We bring friends and volunteers to DC regularly to advocate on behalf of refuge issues. We would not be what we are today without the support of the volunteers that we work with. So I would like to introduce you to some of those volunteers today. The first is probably the most well-known. Bob Ebling was a booster rocket engineer working for a NASA contractor in 1986. In the days before Challenger launched, the weather got very cold. Mr. Ebling and several colleagues warned NASA that the shuttle would likely explode, but they were unable to convince them to abort the launch. After the loss of Challenger, Mr. Ebling retired from NASA and moved back to his native Utah and turned his engineering prowess from rockets to refuges. He created the Friends of the Bear River National Wildlife Refuge after catastrophic flooding broke through the Great Salt Lake's impoundments in 1989. He never stopped working at the refuge and eventually logged more than 10,000 hours. He found peace after the Challenger disaster through the work he was able to do at this fantastic wildlife refuge. He passed away in 2016 at the age of 89. Another retiree named Carl Haller contributed over 50 years of service at the Hagerman National Wildlife Refuge in Texas. He started volunteering there in 1963 and was still conducting weekly bird surveys on the refuge in 2013 when he was recognized by the staff for his long and dedicated work. We called down to Hagerman yesterday to see how Mr. Haller is doing, and we are told that he doesn't get out to the refuge as often anymore now that he's over 100 years old. Another volunteer is a young woman named Caitlin Catteray, who came to DC recently to visit the Massachusetts delegation. She works full-time for the town of Mashpee and volunteers at the Mashpee National Wildlife Refuge in her spare time, and she is just one of the younger generation of volunteers coming through the refuge system. A growing number of volunteers are coming to the refuge in their RVs, and the refuges are responding to that need. George and Peggy Harrison are resident volunteers on Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge in North Carolina. They live in their own camper trailer, and the refuge supplies a pad with full hookups. In return, they are obligated to volunteer for 24 hours a week in return for the rent. But for over 7 years, the Harrisons have spent 7 to 8 months a year working more than full-time at the refuge. It's a win-win for everyone. One group of volunteers at the Loxahatchee National Wildlife Refuge in Florida was affectionately known as the Grumpy Old Men Construction Company, aka the Grumps. The number ranged from 3 to 8 individuals depending on the time of year and when the snowbirds were down from the north. They came every Wednesday and worked for 4 hours doing repair work. Their visits normally involve stopping by to talk with the refuge manager or staff to complain, thus the grumpy part of their name. The complaints range from politics to their thoughts on refuge management, and the refuge staff greatly enjoyed their visits. We can count these volunteers' hours, we can see their accomplishments, but in truth, their contributions to the refuges are immeasurable. We strongly support H.R. 3979 and urge you to pass it from the subcommittee and to the full House of Representatives. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you.
My last question is really for Carolyn Broward. I just would like to know, your testimony, you reference economic benefits to communities when there are a National Wildlife Refuge nearby. But do these refuges receive adequate funding to fully embrace the public? I know this bill actually is to continue the participation of the volunteers, but can you address that?
Absolutely. So the current funding for the refuge system is at about $484 million, and we estimate that full funding for the refuge system is actually at about $900 million. So there's a significant difference between those two numbers. It's absolutely a problem that the refuge system does not get enough funding through operations and maintenance, and we have been working for a number of years to try and increase that. A lot of these refuges are understaffed by a significant amount. There are some states that only have one biologist for the entire state, some states that have one law enforcement officer for the whole state. Some of these refuges, if we get further cuts, they are going to lose their entire environmental education programs. Some refuges don't have staff at all. So absolutely it is a problem.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Ms. Brower, you spoke about the critical nature of our volunteers. You also spoke about the current resourcing for our national wildlife refuges and where those resources are challenged in making sure that these refuges provide the opportunity for folks to enjoy all of the opportunities there. Give me your perspective of not only the importance of volunteers, but what were to happen if we did not allow the program to use volunteers to continue.
Well, I think that, we had talked about the funding challenges for the refuge system and the importance of the time that volunteers put in. But I think that from the times that I have been to wildlife refuges and seen the volunteers, I think one of the most critical things that they do is not only the work that they provide on refuges, but also that connection between the community and that land. And I think that that's a pretty critical thing that the volunteers can actually provide for the system as a whole. When I go to refuges, a lot of what the volunteers are doing that I can see beyond the work that they're actually doing on the refuge. If you go into a visitor center, a lot of the staff there is not full-time staff, they're volunteers. We went up to Patuxent a couple weeks ago in Maryland, and the person manning the front desk was a volunteer. I went up to some refuges in Texas a couple of weeks ago, and the folks working in the gift shops were volunteers. And you will not have gift shops, you will not have these visitor centers for people to go to. It's that visual presence of somebody manning those stations will go away if you don't have volunteers.
Gotcha. Wanted to ask Mr. Ross, both you and Ms. Brower, your perspective about the connection that volunteers allow for the refuge to make with the community. We always talk about planning for refuges, making sure that they're meeting the needs in the community, making sure that there's that connection there, because those lands do belong to the public, and we want to make sure that they understand what's there, and also that there's a value to the community and that they clearly see that value. Give us your perspective about how volunteers allow our refuges to connect with communities, to connect with regions, and is there a value to that, and what do you see as the scope of that with our volunteer community?
I would say actually it brings more people to the area and helps the local economy quite a bit. And as it opens up and becomes more available, you can bring more people in, and we can actually sell it more as a statewide visit. It's going to be definitely a win-win for DU as well as for Virginia.
Ms. Brower?
I agree. I think that the value that these refuges provide to communities is tremendous. They bring in hundreds of millions of dollars in economic activity. It brings jobs to the community. Mr. Westerman had asked questions about hunting and fishing, and those opportunities on refuges bring millions of people to refuges every year to go hunting. And yeah, I just would follow up on one thing that he had asked about why some refuges might be closed. Some refuges are really small, some refuges are close to houses. Or there, one of the examples that I use a lot is Crystal River National Wildlife Refuge in Florida. It was created for manatees, and it's a very small refuge, and there's nowhere to go hunting. So there are numerous reasons for these refuges to be closed. But the hunting and fishing aspect, photography, hiking, bird watching, all of those activities that are part of the big six of the refuge system are critical to bringing economic activity into communities. And like I said before, having this connection between the community and the refuge is critical. You can't have community support for this system of lands unless the people are involved in it.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.